Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for letting me join, at least virtually, in this event. I'm deeply honored to be part of this lineup, and really sorry about having to miss this, at least in person. As I told both Eva and Lutz, I just came back from a trip to Europe. I'm about to take off for a meeting of the National Research Council Gene Editing Committee. That's a joint committee between the NRC, the Chinese Academy, and the UK Royal Society. And in a weird way, it makes me feel at least a little bit better to miss this for work that I think Wolf envisioned for the Institute. Certainly during the last years of his tenure as director, meaning especially at a place like TU Dresden, where really science and society and sometimes the conflicts between them are so deeply visible. The important and crucial role that I think communication plays in the ethical and the legal and the social and the political discussions surrounding technologies like synthetic biology, nanotechnology, CRISPR-Cas9, human gene editing, I think is increasingly important, and it's an exciting area to be in. I want to talk today, though, a little bit in part about this work, but certainly focus more on I think the work that Wolf has done and how it continues to really shape the thinking of every single person in our discipline. And the book on the left, Medienwirkung trotz Selektion, certainly I'm assuming everybody in this room has on their shelves or has read or has at least read parts of. So I want to talk briefly about what I think is relevant, particularly relevant in the short time that I have. I want to talk about how it matters and how this translates with one or two examples into a Web 2.0 environment. And then leave you just with a couple of thoughts about what I think really, where Wolf's work maybe has shown foresight that many of us have benefited from tremendously. And I want to start with a weird slide maybe, and that is me the first day I arrived on the Dresden campus. I'd never been to Dresden. Wolf and many of the people at this table invested a lot of time and effort to make it possible for me to get there. And this was the end of that day where I was jet lagged and completely exhausted from teaching. Also, clearly with a very questionable haircut or the lack thereof. I'm not sure what I was thinking at the time. But the reason why I'm showing this picture, because that day, of course, Wolf also introduced me to a whole number of people, pretty much everybody in the Institute, including Cornelia Mottes. And when I first met her, I remember that I had just seen a really, really good piece that she had written with Wolf. And if you haven't seen that article, this is it, in Communication Yearbook, The Dissonant Self. By all means, I would encourage you to look at this. And Wolf, of course, being always alert, immediately responded and realized that this was not out in print yet and asked me where I had actually seen this. And the story, of course, was that I was one of the reviewers for this piece, that Chuck Salmon had sent it to me. And as I always do when I see articles, when I get reviews, I put them on a shelf and I don't look at them. And then eventually I got yelled at by various editors. And that's what happened here as well. Chuck calls me or emails me on a Sunday and says, look, can you look at this piece? I would like to move on this. And I started reading it. And I got back to him almost immediately and said, this is a really good piece. I think this will be really well cited in Com Yearbook when it comes out. The one thing that I would maybe push the authors on a little bit, and I didn't know who they were at the time, what is the idea that how does all of this apply in a media environment that is increasingly driven by social media, by certainly online modes of communication. And so Chuck's response was, well, why don't you write a commentary? And that's exactly what we did, what Matt Nisbet and I, Matt, who was a student at Cornell when I was there, is now a professor at Northeastern, he was still at American at the time, wrote a response where we outlined some of those thoughts. And I want to share them with you because, of course, many of those thoughts were directly informed by Nelly's and Wolf's original piece, but I think are also things that Wolf and I have had conversations about when I was at Dresden. And I want to talk both in terms of what the empirical reality or what maybe the urgency looks like, and then what some of the models for that look like. And as we're talking about the empirical urgency or the urgency for us to do work in this area, that's probably one area where Wolf and I disagreed a little bit, to which degree the shift and the fundamental transformation to online news environments was similar in the US and in Germany, and maybe was as final and as really transformative as people like me certainly thought, but maybe Wolf didn't quite as much. And I just want to show you data from the US earlier this year, and this is fairly conservative data, because if you ask this for other areas of news, online and social media are even more prominent, but even for political news, which is really kind of the staple of traditional news environments. If you ask people what are the most important sources, the sources that you turn to most often or turn to first, these are the percentages. Facebook leads absolutely. And if you look at even the other sources, so if you look at, for example, national TV or local TV, which again are somewhat favored by the fact that we're asking about political here, they already include mobile apps, they already include websites, and so on. Otherwise, the percentages would already be much lower. And then, of course, in fourth place, you have search engine. So one way or the other, we're seeing a fundamental shift. And if you break this down by cohorts, you see that younger cohorts almost exclusively start relying on online-only news diets, or certainly online-dominated news diets. And the argument that we hear in Germany, that it's all different because we have Rundfunkgebühren, because we have a very strong public television and public media system, is somewhat faulty, of course, because eventually those cohorts that are growing up now being used to not paying for news will eventually be the majority of the voters who will decide if Rundfunkgebühren, if TV fees and everything else are around, or something that's going to be here to stay, or if that's something that's going to go away. But where we did agree, Wolf and I, are what the challenges are. No matter what the degree of the how fundamental a transformation it was. And I just want to show you a graph or a figure that we wrote in the commentary on that piece in Com Yearbook, and where we basically said, look, what's happening is that we're seeing two tendencies that we've known all along overlap. The first tendency is what I would call media-centric filters, something that's not new. We've seen this for a long time, certainly with the emergence of cable, meaning more and more tailored news offerings for ideologically fragmented audiences, or audiences that are fragmented by other interests. What's maybe new is that media now have additional tools to fragment or to tailor. Algorithms as editors being one good example. So the idea that news selection, placement, and so on is no longer done by editorial staff, but is done by computer-based algorithms. The New York Times, before they put things in print, of course, run them on their webpage in order to see how well they perform, how many clicks they get, and so on and so forth. And then they decide about headlines, about placement, about length, and so on and so forth, or about running the story in the first place. The other thing that we know is of course individual level selectivity, and the two intentionally overlap, as you will see in a second. We know from Leon Festinger and others about selective exposure, selective attention, but of course we also know that we all live in highly homophilic social networks. We live with people that think like us. Our neighbors tend to have the same ideologies. They tend to have the same income levels. So in other words, we tend to not just select news ourselves, we also tend to select the environments around us. And again, the word of mouth source that you just saw, remember I showed you the top 5 sources, one of them was word of mouth, of course is heavily influenced by that selectivity. The interesting thing about Web 2.0 is the overlap. It's the idea that we give people new tools to be more selective than they used to be before, new technological tools, and I want to show you one of them. And we also, of course, give media new ways of tailoring while taking advantage of individual level behaviors. For example, search engines tailoring their results toward individuals and toward what they know about these individuals. We've written about this. I'm, for the sake of time, not going to talk about this today, but let me just show you one example for that augmented selectivity, that middle group. And some of you have seen this already, but I apologize, but just for the sake of argument, I'm putting it in here again. We basically were wondering what happens when people have an opportunity with these news aggregators, if that's Flipboard, if that's Feedly, if that's Yahoo News, if that's Google News, what happens when they're being given choices? And being given choices on issues that should not be ideologically charged. In this case, it was nanotechnology, nanosilver, its potential environmental impacts. What we gave people afterwards is we said, here's a number of follow-up things before you answer more questions. This is in a national survey, people being exposed to this information, and then we tell them we're going to ask them more questions, but before that they can look at additional news stories. Which ones would they like to know more of? Which would they select first? The content was randomized, and then every piece of content also randomly got an ideological cue assigned to it. Fox right, MSNBC left, and CBC, excuse me, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, being neutral. And then we wanted to know, of course, well, what happens? Are people really going by content, meaning they read something, they're looking at pro and con arguments about the environmental impacts of nanotechnology, or do they, if given the choice in a news environment to pre-sort based on ideology, do they pre-sort? And the answer is as simple as it is depressing, and that is they pre-sort. And again, you can push back and say, well, that's a problem with the dichotomous news environment in the US. And yes, that makes the effect simpler and more parsimonious. That doesn't mean that the effect and the mechanisms behind them don't work in exactly the same fashion between highly partisan audiences and on highly partisan issues, just thinking about the refugee crisis or a few other things in Germany right now. So what I want to end with are a couple thoughts. Clearly, we're in the middle of a fundamental change of the media system. Clearly, there are results or research that shows us how tremendous the potential is for some of the selectivity, both at the individual level, the media level, and at this augmented level in the middle. And I think as far as the challenges and the questions go, Wolf would very much agree and has devoted a large part of his career to thinking about what the big challenges are for journalism. And we looked at some of that as well. And some of you have seen this, the work on our work on the nasty effect, the idea that uncivil comments surrounding news stories in online settings, both for newspapers, for blogs, for online stories following the Tagesschau or the Heute-Journal, that they shape, just by being impolite, by being uncivil, shape how we think about the article or the contribution or the story that we just read. So they change our views on how biased the journalism is behind the story, but they also polarize us even further into already pre-selected groups. When we came out with that study, of course, we wrote about this in the New York Times as well, which immediately kicked off 400 comments, and then they closed their comment section immediately on this very story, which is ironic. But a few weeks later, Popular Science, one of the key science magazines, shut down their comment section, and in this justification that you see here, wrote that the research that we had done had led them to do that. Now, people didn't respond well to that. It kicked off yet another online firestorm of people being upset about us advocating restrictions on free speech and Popular Science cutting down their comment section. And the New York Times wrote about this. But eventually, the dam started breaking. The Sun-Times, Chicago Sun-Times, one of the larger metro papers, closed their comment section. Reuters closed their comment section. CNN eventually broke down and closed theirs. And then most recently, and this is really the most striking one, Reddit, for those of you who know what Reddit is and use it, Reddit is comments. That's what it's based on. When they started their new news site, Upvoted, they started it without allowing any comments whatsoever. So philosophically, of course, that was one of the most striking, really, breakthroughs. Why am I mentioning this? Two reasons. A, because it's work that directly influences what the work that journalists do. And we talk to journalists from New York to Norway to everywhere about this. And one of the questions that we got again and again is, how do we fix this? And our initial research didn't address that. So we just finished a piece of research that I want to show you really, really quickly That's not published yet, so take it with a grain of salt. But where we basically replicated, first of all, the nasty effect, so the impact of uncivil comments on the x-axis on perceptions of bias on the y-axis. But the interesting thing is we added 2 additional conditions. One is the traditional one, which is the dotted line or the dashed line. But then we had a second condition where we basically gave people simulated moderation. We just added one comment that was allegedly deleted. It just said this comment has been removed by a moderator. So simply the impression that a moderator was in the room undermined that nasty effect, undermined the impact that uncivility can have on perceptions of bias. Now, that kind of research is exactly what, of course, a news organization in many ways should want, because it tells them this is a very easy way of, and a very cheap way in many ways of undermining that effect or of removing that effect largely that undermines perceptions of credibility for your product. Again, my argument being we need more of that work, and we don't need yet another study on the third person effect. We have hundreds of them. We don't need yet another study on uses and gratifications in online environments, but we need work that is really very much in the spirit of what Wolf was doing, meaning thinking about quality journalism and how we can maintain that in a rapidly changing news environment. The last thing I want to leave you with is I think a way of rethinking our media effects paradigms. And Wolf wrote about this before in various handbooks. And many of you have seen this. So the paradigms that our field has, paradigm shifts that our field has gone through from magic bullet, hypodermic needle models, really the propaganda models of pre-World War I, and leading up into World War II as well. The idea that we're all influenced strongly, and hence they're high on the y-axis, by media messages. Lazarsfeld, Berelson, Godet, Elihu Katz, Clapper, all these people, of course, responded pretty quickly between the 40s, mid-40s, and 60s, and said, no, we're really propagating a weak effects model because we believe that there's really just a two-step flow, meaning information doesn't flow directly to audiences, but through opinion leaders or influentials. And at number 2, it's largely reinforcement of pre-existing attitudes. Those were really the 2 key arguments in Lazarsfeld et al. In these various studies in the 40s. In the 70s, we saw Nola Neumann, one of Wolf's mentors, obviously, with a Spiral of Silence call for the return to the concept of powerful mass media. George Gerbner at Penn, at the same time, looking at cultivation as a strong effects model. And then almost at the same time in the 70s, but then with priming more in the 80s and 90s, and the framing research that also started in the 70s, but really came to fruition in our field in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, we saw kind of a return to a much weaker model again. Media don't tell you what to think, they tell you what to think about. It's really subtle differences in framing that shape interpretation and so on and so forth. Not fully limited effects, but really kind of a negotiation of effects between audiences and media, or construction of reality, as Dennis McQuail called it. Where we're now, and this is interesting that we wrote this with Shanto Iyengar, because Wolf and Nelly's chapter, of course, took the Bennett Iyengar piece on weak effects as a starting point to really draw a more refined model, I think, and I believe. But Shanto and I and Mike Cacciatore really think that there's a fifth paradigm, and that fifth paradigm is both weak and strong. It's strong because it has tailored persuasion. It's strong because basically media effects are now tailored toward the individual, toward his or her characteristics. They're made to have an effect on this person. They're made to resonate particularly well with that person. They're made to reach that person particularly well. So a very strong effects model, almost hypodermic needle, because hypodermic needle for you personally. At the same time, of course, we have preference-based reinforcement models, which means I, as an individual, really select largely what I already want to see. I have better tools online than I ever have before for selecting channels and or messages. So in many ways, I'm taking the power back toward really reinforcement a la Lazarsfeld, and some of the things that Lance Bennett and Shanto Iyengar have talked about. One way or the other, I think we're talking about new types of research, and we're talking about new types of models, and certainly the piece that Wolf and Nelly wrote in Com Yearbook, I think was really a stake in the ground toward exactly that end. So I'm going to leave it at that. Again, thank you so much for having me. I hope I didn't go too much over, and I apologize for not being able to deal with questions and criticism on site. But as I told Eva, hopefully I'll be back on campus before too long, and I really look forward to catching up with everybody. Thanks so much.